Hello, this is Astrology Hotline. I'm Kyle Pierce, and joining me today is Milo Offerein. I'm gonna butcher this, aren't I? I just asked you about it too.
Oh, good. Milo Offerein. Hello. Nice to
Offerein.
be here.
Yes, yes. Thank you for joining me. This is actually the first time you've been like an official guest on the show. However, if listeners may recognize you from the wedding fiascos episode, you
Oh,
were
it's true. The
the
secret is out.
yes.
It's me, Ash, the one with the disaster wedding.
Yes. Hope you don't mind
No,
that I
I thought that
outed
was
you.
such a good episode. Yeah, yeah. I really enjoyed that one. I love everything you're talking about. Event charts, Joji, great guest. So an
That
honor.
was a fun one. Yeah. I that was one of my favorite episodes, honestly. Uh we are just kicking off Mercury retrograde recently. I don't
It's
know how
true.
if you've been feeling this one, but one thing I noticed in the news that I thought was kind of hilarious is that Wendy's apparently is now offering like a Mercury retrograde menu or like free food during Mercury retrogrades, like starting now. And it is a Mercury retrograde in Taurus.
Hmm.
Uh, just found very
Did you
amusing.
say Wendy's is giving out free food for Mercury retrograde? That's
That's
amazing.
yeah,
Every restaurant should do that from now on.
I know. I think it's setting a precedent and also seems like the like Mercury retrograde in Taurus thing to do to like soothe the Mercury retrograde
With ice
troubles.
cream.
Yeah, you're
Totally.
just like a free frosty, enjoy.
Very
But
helpful.
it,
I have only been noticing it a little bit here and there. I've been noticing I've been getting like three versions of the same email from people being like, sorry, the last email link didn't work. Here's a new one. Sorry, that was the wrong link. That kind of classic stuff.
yeah, oh yeah.
And then a funny one that seemed especially Taurus is that I um, usually take a lot of notes, like making presentations or like learning or whatever. I'm in school. And so I went to the cafe to take some notes on a presentation I'm going to be doing next week. And I bought these new pens, and they turned out accidentally to be light gray in ink. So, like, you couldn't see the notes on the page. And I thought that was funny because usually I feel like taking analog notes is kind of like a helpful thing during Mercury retrograde, but not in Taurus. Mercury is
Mm.
coming for your art supplies. Like, the ink will be invisible.
Yeah, yeah. It's I know. I feel like I think you said something recently about like trying to escape the Mercury retrograde by like not using technology, just like going analog. But it's like
Mhm.
I feel like you
No,
can never escape.
turns out if Mercury rules talking, thinking, walking,
Yeah.
biking,
Yeah.
driving, taking the bus, like there's like
There's no escape.
there is no escape. We exist. We we always have to connect in one way or another. We are human.
Yep. It's inevitable. But my like initial thought about it was like, wow, like this is like astrology might be like it's becoming such a more popularized thing now. Like Mercury retrograde has like moved into like common parlance, which I
Mhm.
find really interesting. I had like a one of my like a it's like a boss or something, just bring up Mercury retrograde as like a thing in relevance to like a little like email debacle that we had. And I was like, oh wow, like everybody knows what this is now.
Yeah, they're paying attention.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I love
think
it.
Mercury retrograde and Saturn return, those are like the two things that I'm noticing more and more kind of like in the common culture.
Yeah.
People talk about it. And it's funny because sometimes Mercury won't be retrograde, or it won't be your Saturn return, and yet life still happens. There's a lot of other astrology
Yeah.
going on.
Oh yeah.
Um, but I do like that people will be like, is Mercury retrograde? Is it my
Mhm.
Saturn return? What's happening?
Yeah. Is
I'm like,
that
let
the
me tell
cause of
you.
all this?
Exactly.
Um,
Well, I'll have
yeah.
to go get my
Well,
free frosty after this.
oh yeah, seriously. I know, I know. I want to see what it is they actually are offering because I want to take advantage of that. Um, but real quick before we dive into our question for today, uh, why don't you tell the audience just a little bit about who you are? Just,
Oh, sure.
yeah, put you
Hi.
on the spot.
Yeah, I am an astrologer with, especially, I think this is probably not going to come as a surprise, um, but I kind of have like a Hellenistic and medieval focus in my astrology. Um, I love doing synastry. I love having a queer focus as well. Um, I have been a professional astrologer maybe for 2.5 years at this point, although long time astrology fan, like back to my teenage years. Um, I remember, yeah, like taking out library books when I was 16, or I remember I actually was pregnant as a teenager. And so I had my first kid when I was 18. And I remember like interrogating the nurse, like, what is the exact time? I didn't know my exact time at birth, but I was like, my kid is going to know their rising sign. Anyway, outside of astrology, I have a background in social work. So I've done lots of work in like transgender health and like queer education, like doing presentations in schools and things like that. And I'm also a forest therapy guide, which is a very gentle, trauma informed, like wandering in the woods to heal type of a
Mm.
modality. Um, and I have some dreams of being able to kind of integrate astrology and forest therapy together in the future. So we'll see.
I
Uh,
I think there's several easy inroads that you'll find. I think there's
what if it was night? What if we went walking at night?
ooh,
There you go.
love it. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Milo. And I kind of brought you on today because I know you've dealt a lot with the subject of our question, which our question for today comes from Chris, and she asks, Chris writes, I know the lot of fortune is supposed to be important for a lot of different timing techniques, but what exactly does it mean? Also, what other lots are worth paying attention to? There are so many of them, I find it all rather confusing.
Mhm.
Uh, Thanks so much for your question, Chris. And I feel you, to be honest. I also have and still run into a bit of confusion about the lots. Um, there are a lot of them.
A lot of lots.
There are lots of lots.
And
And
luckily for you, dear listener, we got a lot of thoughts on a lot of
we
lots.
got a lot of I like it. All right. See how far we can take this. But fortunately, we could probably say that some lots are like more important than other lots, maybe, or are more relevant. Um,
Mhm.
I almost like think of it as the fixed stars. There's your big, bright fixed stars, your royal fixed stars. You know, the ones that like if you don't read them in the chart, you're missing something big. And then you got like your little ones that like add color, um, add like a more subtle influence that if you were to overlook, you wouldn't like miss out on the big story. But uh yeah, that there's I would say a hierarchy to lots to some degree.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there are the lots, which are called the Hermetic lots, which is basically like 7 lots, one for each of the traditional planets. But even like within those, it's pretty like commonly believed that the lot of fortune and the lot of spirit, as the lots of the sun and the moon, are the most important. And then the lot of fortune, even more so, is given kind of like the status as a place of life, like alongside the ascendant and
Mm-hmm.
the sun and moon. It depends on kind of what era we're looking at. I know that in Hellenistic astrology, a lot of time the places of life were what is it, ascendant, sun, moon, prenatal lunation, and the lot of fortune.
Mm-hmm.
And then that kind of like changed over time in medieval, where they started looking at the ascendant and the midheaven, and then whichever one is your sect light and the lot of fortune. But still, a lot of
Yeah.
fortune made the cut over the
Oh
sun or
yeah.
moon, like in a lot of medieval stuff. So
Totally. I mean it's like one of the default uh placements in most charts you have calculated online. A lot of fortune will show up. Though I know, like, especially when I was getting into astrology, like I didn't know what it meant.
mhm.
Uh I'm hearing that like, oh, it's a place where you're lucky, like it's the fortunate place.
Mhm.
And while that maybe can be true, there's maybe a little more nuance to it, or
Totally.
a lot
Well,
more maybe, but
there is a lot of nuance to lots.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's interesting actually you bring that up. I think that's maybe like one of the most contentious like conversations around the lot of fortune, or like at least like highly debated, of like, does the lot of fortune bring fortune to the place that it is in the chart, or is it a indicator of how bad or good your fortune will be, right? And I think that knowing that it's the lot of the moon is like really helpful in kind of like, digging through those weeds a little bit.
Hmm.
Because if we think about like, if there's a planet conjunct the moon actually does bring fortune
Yeah.
in like the place that it is in the chart. Like the
Hmm.
moon brings fortune there. However, it's also vulnerable, right? Or like porous. And so, like, if you have moon conjunct Saturn or Mars, right? Then we might go, ooh, like that looks a little ouchy for the moon, but also perhaps the moon has that like soothing or balming response sometimes, right? It's kind of like an interplay of the two. And so I
Yeah.
think the lot of fortune is kind of similar, that like it does try to bring fortune to wherever it is in the chart.
Hmm.
However, if it is conjunct Saturn or Mars, or if it's in like quote unquote dark house or something like that, like then it's going to show that like maybe the lot of fortune will have a little bit more difficulty, like really like creating fortune that we can recognize. I mean,
Yeah.
we have that negativity bias as humans anyway. And so if we have a little bit of good in an otherwise sucky part of our life, sometimes it's hard for us to see that good,
Hmm.
but it can still be there.
For sure. Yeah. I think it probably helps to think of fortune. I think we tend to use fortune in terms of positive. Like fortune means like, oh, good things happening to you.
Mm-hmm.
Fortune, like as it's a word, it could be good or bad. And I think that tells you a lot actually about the lot of fortune. I'm going to stop giggling about that eventually, but it is the lot of the moon, right? Um, which adds to basically its relevance as like uh, a making things happen, like a concretization of like events and things around that point,
Mm-hmm.
you could say. But maybe before we really dig into what it means, maybe we should talk about like how is the lot of fortune calculated,
Oh,
or the
sure.
lots in general calculated.
Yeah. So what a lot is is a mathematical calculation, basically. So you're not going to look up in the sky and be like, aha, there it is, the
Hmm.
transiting lot of fortune. um Similar to like the nodes, it's something that doesn't actually exist as like a physical thing. It's a calculation. And even like more so than the nodes, which actually are transiting in the same place for everyone, like the lots are so personal to our charts because you measure the distance between 2 points in the chart, usually between two planets, like say the sun and the moon.
Hmm.
And then you take that same distance and measure from the ascendant. And so that means that for every person, if your ascendant is like uh 5 minutes different than someone else, then the lot of fortune is going to be 5 minutes different, even if
Hmm.
we're measuring the same distance. And then, of course, the additional kind of like a randomizer is the sect related reversals, right? Which
Hmm.
is that if you're born during the day, you would measure one way. If you're born during the night, you'd measure the other. So, meaning like, hopefully I'm correct. I've sun to moon for day and moon to sun for the night for a lot of fortune.
I believe that's
That's
correct. I
I'm pretty
was,
sure you start with the
yeah.
sect light and then you measure to the light that's out of sect.
Yeah, which is like there is some debate maybe modern wise, like in modern forms of astrology, uh which I was spending a lot of time thinking about this recently, of just like how the lots are calculated. um but if the lot of fortune is like supposed to be the lot of the moon and like moon related things and kind of what the moon does, uh to like reverse that calculation, it's it almost like suggests that the sun takes on the role of the moon in a night chart. uh
Right.
Not to throw a wrench in our whole understanding of these things, but it's one of those things that like I can't help but like get a little snagged on. I'm like, well, like, is that how it should work? I think that's what's interesting about the lots in general, is you do get it does get rather theoretical.
Totally. And there's even different astrologers in the past who did things differently. Like
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure Ptolemy didn't reverse for
Yeah.
sect.
Hmm. I think that's right.
And forgive me, everyone, if I get anything wrong. Please, like, I'll be googling things as I'm talking just to make sure that I'm not giving you bad information.
Yeah.
But yeah, but even in like the historical tradition, you see some astrologers not reversing for sect. You see some astrologers being like especially when we get to the Lot of Eros, which is often like the third big lot alongside Lot of Fortune
Hmm.
and Lot of Spirit that we see calculated. Sometimes people would do like a lot of what's called the lot of basis calculation, which is like
Yeah.
from lot of fortune to lot of spirit from the ascendant, and then call that the lot of Eros. Other times people would do like a Venus to Moon or Venus to Saturn or uh, there's like different like, well, what kind of Eros are we talking about? Are we talking about romantic relationships? Are we talking about pleasure in general? There's all these kind of finicky ways that people would measure lots. But to make sure that this is not immediately overwhelming you from like step one, I would say like um my approach to the lots has always been to either choose an astrologer or a tradition that makes sense to me and
Hmm.
just kind of like root there, right? And to see what comes up. Because something about lots that I think is kind of special about them is they're very divinatory. And I mean, even the background of the word, right? It comes from Kleroi or like kleros in Greek, which means like a divinatory kind of like drawing of dominoes or of straws or of
Yeah.
lots, which
Hmm.
is kind of like tarot cards that we have today is like a similar like you draw a little like stone out of a bag and that has whatever marking is on it has something to say about your destiny.
Hmm.
Like there's like that metaphor is really strong because I think because there are so many lots and because the likelihood that you're actually going to calculate any specific one is pretty rare, it means that like when you come at the chart with a really specific question, like the lots are kind of this divinatory way that we can get the chart to speak to us that isn't otherwise obvious, right?
Yeah.
This might be jumping way ahead, but when it comes to some of the like smaller or rarer lots, if you read in the like medieval Islamic tradition, they'll have these basically like formulas or methods of which they would approach a really specific question, like finding the Lord of Hidden Knowledge, which is a way
Mm.
that they would, if someone comes to an astrologer saying, I think I have spiritual or psychic powers of some sort, and what am I supposed to do with that? They would be like, okay, we're going to look at Mercury, we're going to look at the lot of religion. We're going to look at the lot of deep wisdom and understanding. We're going to look at a
Hmm.
lot of this. We're going to look at the second triplicity lord of the ninth, etc. Right?
Hmm.
And then kind of find the El Mutant of all of those things. And so it's like this really specific technique that they would use,
Yeah.
which reminds me kind of like how a tarot spread works, right? Like you'll have a tarot spread and you'll be like, okay, this card in this position is answering this question. This card in this position is answering this question.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like a way of doing that on your chart. You can go, like, I want to dive really deep into this one specific topic. And then you can generate 3 to 5 lots that have like some unique thing to say about it. And it's this divinatory thing that's not always going to be in your chart other than when you calculate them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think you hit on it nicely too, is like this idea that like we use the term like your lot in life or
Mm-hmm.
your this idea of things that are not necessarily like in your control, or like even um how much of something you are allotted. Uh and I find particularly the Lot of Fortune useful for identifying things like that. Like it'll tell you a lot about how so we'll get into a planet's relationship with, say, the Lot of Fortune or maybe other lots, even for calculating something like the Lord of Hidden Knowledge, like, well, is like this planet looking at the lot? Is the planet that rules it looking at the lot,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
is Mercury configured to the lot, or that will tell you something. So it's sort of like it helps connect things in a way that wouldn't be obvious otherwise, but it does have this kind of special faded quality to it where
Mm-hmm.
it's uh just sort of like how how the cookie crumbles, for you to some degree. Um,
Totally.
I wanted
Well,
to correct myself earlier, real quick, or us maybe,
sure.
because the lot of
Do we
the,
give the calculations backwards?
yeah, so the lot of fortune by day is the ascendant degree plus the moon minus Saturn, the sun. Sorry, minus the sun. Uh, Night chart is ascendant minus the moon plus the sun. So like it's still in both cases moon first, like moon as like the starting point of the calculation. It's just a matter of whether you go backwards in degrees from the ascendant or if you go forward.
And
Does
I
that make
think that
sense?
is the same as what we were saying before, but said in a different lexicon that maybe
Yeah.
makes why the moon is kind of like the foundation of the calculation for both
Yeah. I think the
answers
way
that
I
question.
was I was explaining it and thinking about it was based on an inaccurate presumption. So I
Mhm.
wanted to clear that so that
Well,
I'm
and
not
then that brings in
generating
this
confusion.
interesting thing
Mhm.
about like sometimes people have talked about like the nocturnal sect being more associated with like retrogradation or going
Mm.
backwards. You know, the nodes are always moving backwards, which
Yeah.
are associated with the moon. And yeah, and then all the kind of like interesting Venus retrograde stuff that happens. So um yeah, some thinking about it in that way of like, are we going backwards or forwards from the moon? That is an interesting kind of sect connection potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this might not be true actually for all the lots. But they're all basically like a planet, two planets or more, I guess in some
Mhm.
cases, but the distance between a planet and then sorry, the distance between two planets, but like projected backwards or forwards from the ascendant
Yeah.
is being kind of the essential formula. So it's like always it's taking the relationship between two planets, which will be the same for a lot of different people around a different period of time, but the ascendant is always changing. So uh you're always going to get that lot you're going to get that lot in like a different sign depending on when you were born. However, there may be like a bit more of a might be getting ahead of ourselves, but the you'll tend to get it in the same house, perhaps, or it's always going to be like the same distance,
Mhm.
depending on how fast the planet in question is moving.
Yeah, there's this uh formula or I think it's like a Excel sheet or something that Patrick Watson had for sale for a while. I don't know if it's still up, but it's called the um, log calculations in twins. And it's supposed to give you basically if you have twins and you're trying to see what are the differences between their two birth charts because they're
Mm.
only born like 10 minutes apart. You can kind of plunk their two birth times in and it'll spit out where their lots are different from each other. And then
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you can really kind of grab onto those to tell an interesting story of like how the two twins have a different experience in life.
Yeah.
So that's like, yeah, because they're so personal, sometimes the ascendant can change signs for twins, but often it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's not like their lives are totally identical. But you
Yeah.
see like a lot of strong archetypal similarities often in twins. And yet there's still places where it's like, oh, this twin is having a much harder time in life in this area, or this twin's having a much easier time in life in this area. And sometimes the lots can be an interesting way to kind of like tell that story or like juice it up a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I've been finding interesting about particularly the lot of fortune and spirit lately is that like if you were for myself, like I'm a full moon baby, right? Uh which means that like when you calculate my lot of fortune or my lot of spirit or anybody that was born like the same day as me, they're going to tend to have those lots placed in the seventh house. Uh, it might be the sixth house or the eighth, depending on like how close the
Depending on the math.
aspect and the math and like where your ascendant degree is exactly. But it sort of hints that like at like to some degree what a full moon is. It's like an opposition between the lights, but it creates a paradigm in a person's life that has very much that will revolve around like seventh house or sixth house or eighth house topics. Like other people become like more relevant or just those relationships or those uh themes of life because like that is where it's like a center of gravity in those areas. But
Totally.
also when it comes to timing, right, you end up with certain timing techniques will focus on the lots, as Chris mentioned, but it can signify like having big periods of your life sort of run by the planets in those houses or the planets ruling them. So, yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
and I always think it's interesting too that a full moon and a new moon in Hellenistic astrologers would call that like being under the bond or in the bond or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and
Mm.
it's because the lot of fortune and lot of spirit will be like right with the ascendant or the descendant. And so it kind of really like creates vulnerability, I think, sometimes in the life because you have so many eggs in one basket of like your
Yeah.
ascendant and your lot of fortune are like right there next to each other or descendant.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, you could just because that's kind of what the commentary often was about new or full moons is that there's like something kind of vulnerable there, when looking at the moon. Um, and I think that the lots kind of can tell us some interesting stuff around that because it means, yeah, anytime you get a transit to that angle, you're also getting a transit to the lot. It kind of like doubles it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sort of gets me, this is actually something that you suggested once, I think, a long time ago, you were talking about how when two planets are conjunct, um, it basically means that if you run a lot calculated based on the relationship of those two planets, you're always going to get it on the ascendant.
Totally. And so if you have any two planets conjunct in your
Hmm.
chart, the mixture of those two archetypes is
Hmm.
going to be really important for your personality, like no matter where they are in the chart, because all
Yeah.
of their lots are going to be right on your ascendant. That's
Yeah.
something that I think it was actually Austin Coppock said that when he did his like planetary pairs
Hmm.
talk at Norwalk. He said, and also, these are the lots that they make. And that was kind of where I was like,
Ah,
oh, so interesting.
yeah. Yeah. And I guess in the way that like the way that they're very personal and they speak to like your lot in life to some degree. Um, like if say there are some aspects that last a long time, and maybe we'll speak to like an entire age group or like a Saturn and Jupiter will be in the same aspect by sign at least for up to like a good a year or so uh which means that like the lots calculated from Saturn and Jupiter are always going to be trine, so like it will make for that group uh certain like house area of the chart or a certain quadrant of the chart particularly relevant to those topics, which maybe tells you something about like the aspect too, like oh like this has a fifth house dynamic or a ninth house dynamic or like a I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It opens up a lot of interesting doors to like thinking about.
Generational astrology. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it also creates that really contrast between the day and the night chart people, right? Because it's not just are you solar or lunar? It's
Hmm.
also like if you're looking at the lots from Saturn and Jupiter, it's like, oh, are you the fourth house or the 10th house person? Or, like there, it kind of
Hmm.
like it adds a generational flavor
Yeah.
to like what is going on with sect in everyone's charts. Yes, very interesting, very
Hmm.
fun. And I mean, your lot in life, that's like so part of the etymology and stuff of this word too.
Hmm.
Like the other place that word Kleroi or kleros was used um, is like in ancient Sparta. It's like how they divided land among people. And so there was this kind of like almost like communist-esque idea that like they would divide the land equally in Sparta and then every citizen would have equal land and then everyone basically needs to give an equal portion of crops back to the community so that like everybody's working, everybody's eating, there was that kind of idea,
Hmm.
which I think is how some people think fortune works. It's like, oh well, we're all born, we all have a body, we all have a life, therefore we're born equal. But of course, like this system was like pretty broken even from the beginning, in that like it only counts for citizens. So a bunch of like ethnic groups were excluded in ancient Sparta. Lots of women were excluded, not all
Yeah.
women, but like lots were. And then over time, this kind of Kleroi system broke down more because there'd be like people bequeathing land amongst themselves or like generationally passing land on to like more or less kids and subdividing it. And so then, you know, once this system has kind of like degraded for a while,
Hmm.
then you have the situation in Sparta where everybody still owes the government the same amount of crops, but you don't have the same land to work with, right?
Yeah.
And so that I think is like the other story of like how fortune works in the real world, which is like if you look at like, oh, we don't all have the same like institutional support to be successful, right?
Hmm.
It's so I
For
think it
sure.
tells both sides of that story, the like privilege thing, right? If we're talking about fortune, it's
Hmm.
like, yes, we all are alive. That is like
Yeah.
how we are equal, and like both philosophically and literally, we are equal, right? And then also we're not treated equally, you know, because of all this kind of like ways that the system has broken down over time around us. And so the lot of
Hmm.
fortune, I think it kind of speaks to that, right? It's the lot in life. It's like, here
Yeah.
we are, we're alive. What do you got to work with?
Exactly. And that's maybe a good like starting point would be to just like spend some time with a lot of fortune as like a what it does, what it means, which we had already mentioned. You had already mentioned. I don't know. Somebody said it that the it's also like called the lot of the moon, right? And so you get that like in Vedic astrology, at least certain types of it, they treat the moon itself as a sort of secondary ascendant, just like reading from the moon. Like day or night chart doesn't matter. Like this house from the moon, the fourth house from the moon will tell you something about fourth house things for the person in their life because the moon has that job of bringing things into material being. I always think of like when you breathe out on like a cold winter day, if you have like a piece of glass nearby onto a window, that the breath of life sort of consolidates and forms something physical that can be seen, like it materializes. Which doesn't always happen if there isn't something there for it to materialize on, nothing really materializes, right? So the moon has that job of like, oh, the breath of like whatever was breathed out from the universe that the moon was there to catch gets sort of brought into very physical, visible, tangible materialization. And the lot of fortune carries that signification with it. And so you'll get a lot of like reading houses from the lot of fortune as well. And even one thing that I learned from Austin Coppock was this one way to use the lot of fortune was just planets with the lot of fortune or planets in close aspect of the lot of fortune will tend to show up in like really tangible, literal material ways. Um, will become like visible in a person's life in a more like literal way. And that is one that I have found has pretty consistently showed up. It's not like, the 100% perfect rule all the time, but it's one of like the ways that I tend to use it pretty regularly because otherwise I don't spend a ton of time with the lots. And it's in part why I brought you here because I know you've worked with them quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, because having something conjunct the lot of fortune is in a way like having something conjunct your ascendant. Like
Yeah.
it's just really
Hmm.
loud. Actually, I can read the little quote about fortune houses from Valens.
Hmm.
Um, this is like a yeah, Vitius Valens quote from the free translation that you can find online. He said, in addition, after finding the place which has been assigned to fortune, examine the points square with it and the other aspects, just as with the angles in the natal chart. The lot itself will be equivalent to the ascendant and will mean life. The 10th place from it will be equivalent to the midheaven and will mean rank. The seventh will be the descendant, the fourth, the IC. The other places will have the same effects as the 12 places. Some astrologers have mystically hypothesized, this part's interesting, that the astronomical ascendant and the point square with it are the cosmic angles, while the
Hmm.
lot and the point square with it are the natal angles.
Hmm.
So that's very interesting because like he's like basically saying that the if you take the lot of fortune as the ascendant and then derive houses from it, that is like where the really literal stuff is going to come from. And if you use the actual ascendant, like literally where the horizon is, this is the cosmic angles, which maybe
Hmm.
have like a bit more of a like spiritual or ethereal kind of overtone to them.
Yeah. Which I think speaks to like what the lot of fortune is supposed to be, which is a lot like what the moon is. It's like you don't control the body that you're born into, as far as we know, at least. We don't have any. You may have a belief system that says that we do, and I can't prove you wrong. But as far as we know, in terms of when you emerge, like you didn't choose whether or not you have a heart defect or whether or not you have all five fingers on both hands. Like those are not things that you got to choose. They're just part of your lot in life. And that is, I think, one of the central themes around a lot of fortune is it's not necessarily stuff that is in your control. It is stuff that kind of happens or befalls you, or is just a circumstance of your life and or of your environment that like you're kind of working with on an ongoing basis. And like if you get support from that, if that is positive, right? If you have like a really good Jupiter on your lot of fortune, like a lot of open doors for you, right? But if you have like a really difficult malefic sitting on it, like it might indicate like a lot of challenges to like you weren't like you probably in most cases weren't born to like a super wealthy family like with a lot of privilege, like the things like that. And I do find that those sorts of delineations tend to resonate pretty well. Like it just kind of it gives you a really good idea of like what the sort of starting like if you're starting Monopoly game where like everybody gets a different amount of money at the beginning. like oh, you didn't start with, you got like $5 and what's the first set of properties, like the purple one.
I don't know.
You know what I'm talking about? I don't know.
I do know of the game Monopoly. I know you
Yeah.
can be a Scottish Terrier, you can be a thimble.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, you don't get, what is it? Park Avenue? That's the expensive one.
Yeah. Well, like when you get to like the end game, right, where everybody, all the properties are sort of bought up, like if you don't have like a monopoly on a couple different sets of properties, you're screwed. Like you're not gonna win. Like unless you get really, really lucky. Um, sorry, it's a little harsher than I wanted it to be, but it's just a fact. Like if you start in unfortunate, difficult circumstances, it doesn't mean that like you will not succeed at anything, but it stacks things against you, and it's a lot harder to achieve things. There are those stories of people who do like overcome those sort of initial obstacles, but
Of
like it
course.
just stacks things against you, and that's a real thing.
Hmm.
And I think it's one of the ways that astrology can account for that, and a way that uh doesn't have to be like scary and threatening, because it's not, that's not your fault, and it's not
Yes.
like there's nothing you can do about it. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to fortune and the fortune houses, yeah, it talks about literal things, but I think that it is malleable in the way that like you can make real changes in the real world,
Yeah.
right? And then we've got our cosmic houses, the ones we're more familiar with, which are kind of like show us the ideal of like if we're really, following the path that has been laid out to us, all these like things that can happen for us, that's shown in our like regular houses that we're used to. I
Hmm.
think the fact that those are the ones that most people are familiar with actually is like, it means that we can just look at the fortune houses for another like reminder or like insight into being like, oh, okay, how can I kind of mush these together? I mean, I have a planet that's conjunct fortune in my
Hmm.
chart. It's Jupiter in Virgo in the third house. And so it's interesting to think about it in a either benefic or malefic way, because
Yeah.
obviously it's a benefic that is in detriment.
Hmm.
Um,
Mixed
but
bag
yeah,
maybe.
it shows up in my life really literally that
Hmm.
like I was raised in this evangelical family. I have 12 younger siblings. So there's like the, Jupiter in the third, lots of siblings. They're
Hmm.
all very religious. And so it's this like, it's definitely a blessing. Like, it's like, oh, I have this big family, all these like relationships. Like, I grew up loving people, and I feel like a lot of who I am is like because of that experience that I had growing up in this like evangelical homeschool giganto family. But like, of course, there's also the like the hard parts of it, which is
Yeah.
like what happens when you don't share the same beliefs? What happens when your parents can't afford extracurriculars for any of you because there are simply too many, or not even
Or
money,
yeah,
time, right? Like, what if you just like literally are, if you're dividing your time more narrowly because you have all these kids, the way that that can impact your life of like what feels possible, what feels not possible. And then like
totally.
it continues to evolve, of course, as they get older. Like my I continue having like more and more younger siblings.
Mhm.
So that number is just like asterisk. Like maybe there'll be more siblings by the time this is published.
Wow.
Um, and so
There's,
it's
there's
just
still
like
still at
it's
it, huh?
always yeah, it's just like always a fact of life that like my mom is like always going to be caring for a newborn baby. Like if she can no longer birth one, she'll adopt one. If she can no longer adopt one, she'll foster one.
Yeah.
And so like, just like it changes the way that like even like my kids having a connection to her as a grandparent is like
Yeah.
maybe different than you would usually expect, because there just is like that's just such a literal always part of my life, is that there's just always going to be more siblings.
That's it's insanely literal too, because it's Jupiter that like wants to be the world expanding, creating opportunities for you planet, but it's like in Virgo, like, but you have so many siblings, like I can only do so much for you right now. Like I have to, my attention is divided between
Mhm.
many different material responsibilities. So like I'll do my best for you, but I there's a lot to sort out here. You know, you're
Totally.
you're one of many.
And I always feel like putting the disclaimer anytime I talk about my family is like, I totally love my family unequivocally.
Hmm.
I like never try to sound like I'm complaining. It's just often people make assumptions like, wow, what must that be like? And it's like, yeah, it's as complicated as anyone else's family, I'm sure.
Yeah, but the unique complications, I
It's very
guess.
unique.
I don't really think about this very often, but I do have a planet conjunct my lot of fortune. But it's Neptune in Capricorn. So I don't really, I haven't thought about that much as like, well, does that even count? Because it's like not a visible planet. But uh, I can say that if I were to explain my the circumstances of like my upbringing, it would be extremely confusing and convoluted and like hard to articulate because there's a lot of weird like relationships between people that would be like I don't even know where to start. And so I'm not going to, but it's that's the most I could say for whatever Neptune is doing.
I mean, isn't that how most people delineate Neptune anyway? It's like, I don't know what's happening in that house.
Yeah,
It's just like, ooh,
yeah.
it is what it is.
Just maybe why Neptune has something like with like cinema and photography will get associated for a lot of reasons that make sense. But I was just thinking of how like it would just be easier to show you like with I don't know,
Right.
be easier to paint it or make a movie about it than to like try to explain it in detail.
Because a lot of it is about the poignant internal like map that's happening in your
Yeah,
head.
yeah.
Yeah.
It is like impossible to articulate and is rather illusory or like subject to your own subjective narration that may or may not be accurate.
Like, you want to know about me? Let's just
Yeah.
drop acid and watercolor.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Let's do that. Yeah. Uh, though I guess had a lot of formative experiences around the use of hallucinogens. So you know, maybe I need to lean into that some more. Just need to be on acid all the time, and that'll be the path to my fortune.
I'm not sure I'm like straightforwardly recommending that, but like, you do you.
Yeah. No. But yeah, carrying on.
Did
What
you We do have an example chart of someone with a planet conjunct fortune, which could be useful to hop into, which is the Alex
yeah.
Trebek
Oh
example.
yeah. Yeah. Dive into that.
Sure. Do you want me to share my screen?
Please do.
Okay. So, something funny about the examples that I put together for this conversation is that I didn't like try to do really deep cuts or anything really specific. Like I was scrolling through public charts on Luna, and so you'll notice a lot of the example charts like start with A because I would just be like, oh, that's a celebrity I recognize. Let's check it out. Oh yeah, it fits perfectly.
Mhm.
Um, so before we were recording, we were talking about Alex Trebek being a Virgo rising. Oh, right. I should describe for the audio listeners. Um, he's a Virgo rising with Neptune in Virgo as well, close to the like 28-degree ascendant. Um, he's got Mercury in Cancer, retrograde in the 11th whole sign house. He's also a Cancer sun. So that Mercury sun, uh, I guess you would not quite count this as a Kazemi, but really close conjunction.
Depending on which orb you use, some like
That's true. It's within 1 degree.
I consider there to be something there with like within 1 degree.
Mhm.
Um, you know,
So let's call it a Kazemi. I like that.
yeah.
Alex Trebek has a Mercury
He
Kazemi for
seems like
sure.
he would have a Mercury Kazemi. He's got a special talent. Like,
Yeah. So Sun, Mercury conjunction in Cancer. And then we've
uh,
got Venus in Gemini conjunct the midheaven within 1 degree as well. And then the Lot of Fortune. I'm just kind of saying the ones that are stand out to me. A Lot of Fortune is in Taurus in the ninth whole sign house. It's at 5 degrees. And not too far away, there's a Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Taurus.
hmm.
And so I thought this was an interesting chart to look at to just kind of like dive into what's the difference between the ascendant, the cosmic ascendant, if we'll use Valentin's term,
Yeah,
and the natal ascendant, which
the
is the
cosmic ascendant
Lot of
sounds
Fortune.
exciting.
Um, and so, like for Alex Trebek, being a Virgo rising, I think that makes total sense. Like known as somebody who has like quite an intellect, um, and like that Mercury Sun in the 11th, like has lots and lots of very faithful fans. Maybe in Cancer speaks to some of like how it felt like a family, all the like Jeopardy fans. Maybe that's like how he kind of like experienced that, right?
Yeah. Mind if I
Yeah,
jump in real quick for a
go
second?
for it.
But
Yeah.
I seeing a lot, I guess. But I'm just thinking about also the decan, the third decan of Cancer, which has to do with like this like uh overflow of like wealth, kind of like the like having a lot and what do you do with like the excess and like just his job as like Jeopardy host. Part of that was like uh giving the giving out of like wealth to people. You get on the show, you have to compete for it, which there's something with Venus there in the third decan of Gemini, and like the only one can
Win.
yeah, there can be only one. Like
Mhm.
like
Right. Well, and I
yeah.
think that Venus, when we start looking at Venus as being the Lord of Fortune, because that's the other thing that the Lot of Fortune gives you a planet that rules it, that takes on that additional signification, right? And
Mhm.
so it's interesting to see how maybe that personal experience of having this big like fan base, that might be what the Mercury in the 11th is speaking to. But then if we look at the Lot of Fortune in Taurus, pretty close to this Jupiter Saturn conjunction, it's very like, yeah, like you are somebody who has access to material wealth and like
Mhm.
is able to like, he made a bunch of money off of having like 36 seasons of the show. It's a show where you give people money, prize money. And then if we look at the ruler, Venus and Gemini, really angular on the midheaven, it's like, well, it's like a trivia game show, right? That's so Venus and Gemini, but like a really
Mhm.
influential trivia game show maybe
Yeah.
speaks more to that, especially Jupiter in Taurus, but Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Taurus, right? It's like a long running, uh, quite like a place that like, yeah, you're giving people sizable chunks of money for their
Yeah.
trivia game show knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's just like I think it shows up so literally the Lot of Fortune stuff in his chart, whereas maybe that Mercury Kazemi ruling the ascendant, maybe that's more of his like personal experience, right? It's not
Yeah.
like what the public sees him as
Oh,
much. Unless you're a fan. I mean, unless you're a fan.
well, see, I guess this is how I'm thinking about it right now is
Mhm.
like the Mercury Kazemi is kind of him, you know, and Kazemis will sometimes speak to like just like a little like a little slice of special skill in like some area. And like I'm just thinking about Alex Trebek and like his role on that show, like and probably what made him like a great host was that like he is was somebody that like you just felt like he was family if you watched Jeopardy every day of like for how many, like 30 years he was on that show.
I think it
Like
was 36 seasons that he did.
yeah, he was like such a staple and such a like a person that I liked Jeopardy in part. Like I don't want to, I had no interest. I Drew Carey I liked for other reasons, but as the host of Jeopardy, I'm not I don't know. It to me it seems like Alex Trebek was what made that show like feel like comfortable and like I don't know, warm even because
Hmm.
otherwise it's just kind of a quiz show. Like
Hmm.
you need sort of like that like somebody you want to like have in your home. Alex Trebek seems like that like warm, friendly presence. But man, I'm wondering what to think of this Mars square the Jupiter Saturn though too. But
Hmm.
it's beside the point.
I mean,
Um
yeah, there's that really close,
a lot in his chart.
especially to Jupiter. It's like partile square
Yeah, that's
from the Mars and Leo in the 12th.
yeah. I want to like dig into his life. Do you know anything about his because we got the moon sextile really tightly the lot of fortune.
Hmm.
Which I would like just sort of look for something maybe like in like some way that like moon and Pisces shows up in a very like literal way in his relationships like he maybe married like a really youthful dreamy like person.
I
I
don't
don't know.
know
I'm
who
curious who his wife is
I
or
did one
was.
time watch after he passed away.
Mm-hmm.
There, I found myself watching a vlog of someone who was going to his estate sale, and she was like vlogging being in Alex Trebek's mansion and like checking
Mm-hmm.
out the different stuff. And something that really maybe could speak a tiny bit to this Mars, but probably more just like a Virgo rising thing in general, is he had this whole like garage full of like woodworking supplies that was all like super immaculately organized, like
Mm,
every like drill head was in like a color coded label little drawer and things like that. And so he did have this like hobby, woodworking hobby. um
interesting.
it's funny you bring up the moon. This can start getting into some of the fortune houses delineations too,
Oh yeah.
because the places that if you're doing houses from the lot of fortune, even though that bit that we read from Valens, he's like emphasizing the angles from fortune, but also there's a lot of emphasis put on the 11th from fortune too as being like the place of acquisitions. um, and so if this moon in Pisces is the 11th house from the lot of fortune, and then maybe we could also look at that Saturn in Taurus as being the ruler of the 10th from fortune place, which is Aquarius.
Yeah.
There's maybe something we could delineate there too, of being like just telling us a bit more about like how it is he came into such notoriety, but especially that moon in the 11th from fortune, it really like underlines what we were already talking about with the Cancerian themes of like there's this kind of like family through the TV thing, or like this
Yeah.
like just like being an iconic part of nostalgia for a lot of people. Because I know my grandparents, I would go to their house in the trailer park, and they would have Jeopardy on and on their like black and white TV, uh, just all the time. It was like, yeah, Jeopardy or baseball, right?
Yeah. No, that is interesting. It's like a it's lunar, like a lunar presence, but like kind of available to all, like a more of like a Piscean kind of like through the TV sort of bleeding into the lives of millions. Like
Mm-hmm.
he's also Neptune on the ascendant, which I guess
Yeah,
can have some of that like
TV persona.
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it makes sense that we don't know what's going on with that Mars in the 12th because he's a TV persona. That's all we
Yeah.
know about him, right?
It's
But
the part
something
that
that
you don't necessarily see. Yeah.
yeah, something that I looked at his chart for also because another place that Valence talks about is the eighth from fortune for talking about like manner of death of the
Hmm.
person. And this was one that I haven't seen shown up like as like concretely as some of the other techniques to use a lot of fortune.
Hmm.
There could be a little bit here because I'm pretty sure he died of pancreatic cancer. Let me just check my notes. Actually, I have it written in here. Mhm. I don't know. Yeah, it's a pancreatic cancer. And this is something that is way more associated, I think, with just with Virgo in general, right? Like that's a part of the body ruled by Virgo. What Valens looks at like the sign of the eighth from fortune to look at like what body parts are more at risk. And I haven't heard of anything like really like sciatic or like hip related going on in his life. Although potentially the like Jupiter ruling Sagittarius from that like first fortune house could speak a bit. I know as he was passing away, he was really insisting on like staying on the show and like, going through like staying on Jeopardy as long as possible.
Hmm.
And there's this interview with him where he's saying like I basically can't talk anymore, and like Taurus is associated with the
Mm.
throat, right?
Yeah.
And he's like there's going to be a point where they're going to tell me that like this cannot go on, but I'm going to try to stay as long as I can. So that there's like something there, but
Oh
that
yeah.
Saturn Jupiter conjunction in Taurus, which is like shows like in the events surrounding while he was dying, like this kind of like tells a part of that story of how he's like, I'm gonna stay and I'm gonna, even if I can't talk anymore, like I'm gonna try to continue hosting the show. But like the actual cause of death just seems to be like a ascendant type thing.
Yeah, that I've run into this like a lot with the like sometimes you see eighth house stuff showing up around death things, whether from fortune or from the ascendant, but like it's hard to like get real consistent results. But that kind of makes sense though too with the way you described it made a lot of sense. I actually happen to have a conjunction at the almost the exact same degree of Taurus, but I know that like that decan is very much about like maintaining a very consistent like rhythmic presence, just like doing the same thing every time and like slowly putting in the work and time until like the results sort of like accumulate over time, and just thinking that like I mean he did the same show every day of the week for God knows how long, but just even like as he's dying, like Saturn is just like we're gonna keep going regardless of how I feel until I literally can't talk anymore.
Yeah.
Interesting way for that to play out.
And like even just being in the ninth house, thinking about like the motivation behind that, like there must have been actually some really like this is a really important thing in the world.
Hmm.
Like I am like creating an accessibility of knowledge for the people, or like there must have been some kind of sentiment like that behind it.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because yeah, like
Being in like a stable fixture in people's lives is like
mhm,
his role in the world. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and maybe I can really quickly show Chaka Khan's chart as well,
Mm.
just if we're talking about fortune houses, because hers was one that kind of showed up when I was thinking about just looking at houses from fortune again. So she's a Scorpio rising, and she has a lot of fortune in the ninth in Cancer, which is pretty close to the moon and also pretty close to Uranus. Um, but for her, we see in the 11th from fortune, which is Taurus, you've got both benefics there, Jupiter and a Venus retrograde, also Mars as well, conjunct Venus. And then in the 10th from fortune is the sun in Aries, so like an exalted sun. And I just thought that that was kind of like a nice example that I came across of showing how, like, if we're looking at her chart from the cosmic angles, we can look at her midheaven in Leo, and it is ruled by an exalted sun. So we're like, cool, cool. But it's in the sixth. Um, there's not a ton of really. There's like a square from Jupiter to the midheaven, so you can see some of that maybe like promise for fame. But it's really, if you look at the fortune houses, like, exalted sun
Yeah.
in the 10th, and then you've got both of them in benefics in the 11th, which shows that, she got so many rewards for her music over like decades. Um, like it really shows like this is how it played out. This is how she had that little bit of potential, and then she just is like, bam, like she got rewarded for it. And I think it really shows up through the fortune houses.
Oh my God, this is actually so. You see, like the Jupiter. We got another Jupiter in Taurus actually in this second decan of Taurus, but
Mhm.
that would be the Fortune 11th, right? So like the place of accomplishment, achievement. Um, and she is well that decan in particular. Taurus has this like, music, rhythm and sound and like feel good artsy stuff, right? But the second decan is like really has a lot of like themes around rhythm. And what's interesting is that she's like known as the like the queen of funk. She says like Mars conjunct Venus in Taurus too, which is interesting. Like that, like funk. I love funk music because it is like it plays with rhythm in such a way that like feel like it pokes at what Taurus wants to do. It like pokes at steadiness and creates something that's steady, but like sort of drops you and like picks you back up. And it's like I don't know. I fucking love punk music or funk music.
Do more, do more.
Yeah, no.
Funky sounds from Kyle Pierce.
Yeah, that's only on Patreon, maybe.
And even just delineating the house of the placement of fortune, it's interesting because we had a ninth house, a lot of
Uranus
fortune
on the lot of
for,
fortune too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Like Alex Trebek had a ninth house, a lot of fortune, and it really came in through like being like about knowledge, right? About intellect and about disseminating that. But for her, I think it's much more of kind of spiritual. I mean, like Chaka Khan, her name she like received from like a spiritual advisor, and
Yeah.
she would do like spots on like celebrity ghost stories and stuff like that. Talk about her beliefs and especially kind of her connection to kind of maybe like African traditional belief systems. And so I think that's like part of what the Lot of Fortune is speaking to as well, is just like her, how important spirituality is to her. And then it shows based on the derived houses, we can see how much success she is given materially, which kind of like gives her more of a platform to maybe talk about that stuff that's important
Yeah.
to her.
And even just like the moon in Cancer too, like the spirituality that is based on like ancestral roots and like kind of drawing from like that source, that reservoir to like create the spirituality. But just
Totally.
like in terms of like you're looking at like just raw like signifiers for be like an eminence factor.
Totally.
Be having like a dignified ruler conjunct the lot of fortune, like just right there.
Mhm.
Um, while traditionally they probably wouldn't have loved having it in the ninth just for angularity's sake.
Mhm.
Uh,
Cadence.
yeah, it's technically cadent, and I don't know if that would have been. I don't know like a ton about Chaka Khan's like rise and like the details of her career,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, I the ninth house is interesting because it has like a trine to the ascendant, but it's cadent. And so a lot of times I think they would say like it's not typically good for material things, but it is good for like your internal world.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, totally having this like Cancer moon ruling the lot of fortune, that really like adds additional nuance to what, if we see she's a Scorpio rising,
hmm,
ruled by Mars in Taurus, that would
yeah,
maybe give us like more of like maybe there's some hard stuff going on with relationships here.
hmm,
It could be like a really straightforward way to look at that. But yet that moon in Cancer gives like a really different testimony
for sure.
for
Yeah,
for her like success, just like manifest success.
it starts to look a lot more eminent, and if you're thinking of it from the lot of fortune, is it like in the fourth on the angles from fortune, you got an exalted Saturn, an exalted Sun, and a dignified in its own sign moon. Uh, that's like a pretty powerful combination. If you're just looking at it from the ascendant, it's in like the sixth, 12th, and ninth.
Yep.
You probably would get a lot out of looking at both themes, but like it does seem to beef up the chart in a way. Like it gives it a little more raw power than maybe it would otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Well, and where I'm curious because like yeah, my lot of fortune does that to my fortune houses too. I
Mm-hmm.
have it in a cadent house, and so it kind of brings angularity to those like
Yeah.
falling away places.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a Cancer rising, so Gemini, my 12th house would be my 10th from fortune.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though I don't have planets there, it's just interesting to kind of think about it philosophically, like, oh, like there's something about my, career or like what I'm supposed to be doing in the world, which is like bringing those maybe marginalized topics like more into the open, or there's some kind of delineating we can do there, just even
Hmm.
seeing how the like if it's your 10th from fortune, 12th from the ascendant, what
Yeah.
does that say if you combine those two things together? And I kind of think about like if you use whole sign houses, you're used to the midheaven and the IC sometimes like floating, like maybe
Hmm.
into the ninth or the 11th. But the lot of fortune kind of gives that happening to the ascendant too. It's like, oh, what would it be look like if your ascendant was in the fifth or like whatever, right? Like
Yeah,
you kind of have that opportunity to blend signifiers.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about like you as a person, how often I've seen you create these like really well formatted, like structured, organized presentations of data, uh, which just seems like benefic Virgo to me. Um, Seems like a part, not all your whole story, but like uh, it strikes me because like you probably saw if you're watching on video that we had some notes and stuff. I don't do that. Like I don't create like really nice notes. That's probably why the show is the way it is sometimes. But uh, to me, I experience that as pretty benefic. Like, oh yeah, I love this. I love having that sort of structuring of data. Or I would love to have that as a skill. I do not. I have the South Node in Virgo, and it's like that's it.
Yeah, it's
Like, eh,
interesting. I've
no,
heard
no, thanks.
some people say, like, there's this podcast, The Mercurianians, run by Cameron and Stella. I've heard Cameron on there say that, like, you kind of grow into your fortune houses more over
Mhm.
time. And that's something I've heard floating around. And I would say that when it comes to thinking of myself as being mercurial versus lunar, right? Because Mercury rules my lot of fortune, the moon rules my ascendant. I
Mhm.
would say, like, over time, I do see like that shift happening. And there's a few other astrology things that kind of, I was born with Mercury retrograde, but through secondary progressions, it's kind of station direct now.
Mm.
Maybe that's helpful. Um, but like if I think back to when I was younger, I did always want to write stuff down, but I didn't even have a notebook to keep it all in. Like I would just be like writing on the backs of piece of paper, and I'd be like drawing my calendar for my months and then losing it and then drawing it again. I didn't have a wall calendar for whatever. I would draw my own calendar on like the back of a receipt and then lose it. Like it was totally like
That's yeah.
comedically disorganized. Um, but over time I got into bullet journaling and Notion and all these kind of like stereotypical productivity dork type things. And it was like really helpful. I was just like, oh wow, look at this.
Yeah.
Um, and I've always been interested in like conversation, but like more and more, like I got hired for a job when I came out of college to work for that trans health program. And a huge part of it was public speaking. Like I
Mm.
did like 2 to 5 public speaking gigs a day sometimes. Like it was like really like so much public speaking. I would be like, going from venue to venue talking about stuff. And so when I got into astrology, I was like, okay, my Mercury is in Sagittarius, retrograde in the sixth house. Like how how is it that I'm somebody who's like becoming known as like a writer and speaker, right?
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah. Right.
I was thinking, I mean, I had my Vedic chart done. In that, I'm a Gemini rising, so that kind of brings it in.
Oh,
But I thought it was interesting how in tropical, Mercury rules a lot of fortune. And so I was like, oh, okay, I can like see
hmm.
where Mercury is kind of holding some power.
Yeah. Well, it has a mutual reception with Jupiter.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Also, I've seen Mercury and Sagittarius a lot in people who talk a lot for a living. Like which I mean, it's almost like on its surface, uh, it's not a dig at you particularly, but like you can just like
I got thick skin. It's okay.
like Mercury and Sagittarius is it doesn't like seem to prevent talking or like communication or even like effective communication. I think what happens, and it probably helps that you have Jupiter and Virgo, two working together, is like Mercury deals with like kind of facts and figures, and like Gemini, the opposite sign, isn't looking for the truth. It's like just information,
Mhm.
doesn't have to be the truth. Many different things can be true at once, while Sagittarius is maybe looking for like a big truth that
Yeah, so it can be like
like
grandstanding or like
yeah,
preaching.
yes, or
Totally.
jumping, or yeah, like thinking something's true and then being like, oh wait, but what about this
Mhm.
other thing? Like, well, I don't know. It seems like it would be
Oh
a
yeah.
a, a
Especially in
process of
my
figuring out what is true, like a
yeah. Especially in my youth, I was like so driven by morality, like my own kind
mhm.
of like social justice ethic. Like if I was on a SkyTrain, like a subway, like going somewhere, and I heard some like two ladies having some conversation and I didn't agree with what they were saying, I would like walk over there. I'd
Gotta
be
say
like,
something, huh?
excuse me, like
Yeah.
we can all hear what you're saying, and you're very big offensive right now. Yeah,
That's it.
so
Yeah.
very Mercury and Sag, like I was like, I'm gonna
Mm.
let you know what I am thinking about whether you are right or
Yeah.
wrong morally, not like factually, morally.
Yeah.
And I think I've like
Yeah.
matured somewhat in like maybe
Yeah.
having a more like notion of like what kinds of intervention are effective when it comes to trying to create a more socially just world than just like
Yeah.
yelling at people.
Yes.
And I'm
Maybe there's
glad that
yeah.
I never had a ton of social media when I was younger. Like I super see myself in like kids on the internet today. Like, oh, that's what I would have been like if I grew up on social media. But I just did it in person. I would, yeah, walking down the street. I was an active bystander.
That that's perfect. That's exactly it. Probably that helps though, the perception. It's like leaving room for maybe nuance of truth or something like or like room for different opinions maybe, we
Sure.
don't
And
all
I
have to
mean,
agree. We have
Cancer
Libra
rising,
planets
we
too.
just want people to heal in the end. So
Yeah, just think about the Sagittarius being the sixth house of Sagittarius, and it's just like a lot of work to like hold really strong opinions. It's easier to like be a little more flexible and adaptable, or not even talk about politics sometimes. I mean, I have a lot of opinions too, but I'm like, it would be a lot easier if we just don't talk about any of that, and that'll keep things a lot like more comfortable, which is where I want to live. Isn't
well,
comfortable.
I have way too many Sag placements for that. I'm
Yeah, I
sorry.
know, I know, I am. Oh yeah. Anyway, what
Did you have some charts you wanted to throw up and see what comes out?
I'm debating whether or not um you know what? I'm going to we'll throw up and mostly because I was looking at it yesterday and I just thought it was a fun chart, but I'm gonna pull up Drew Barrymore's chart real quick.
Drew Barrymore.
Uh
Aha. I see a lot of fortune.
yes. There we go. All right.
Scorpio.
Yeah, where is it? Oh yeah, it's in Scorpio.
Conjunct Uranus.
Yeah, so conjunct Uranus, and when it comes to like the lot of fortune, uh the only real aspect of the lot of fortune is
The
the
sun.
the sun, which I'm just thinking about like how Drew Barrymore is um a movie star, right? Uh but like granted she has a healthy stellium of planets in the 10th house. But I feel like her characters, they tend to be these, granted I haven't seen a bajillion, but they're these kind of like dreamy, like absent-minded, but like good-natured and like adorable, like
Yeah,
lovable.
she's the lovable, relatable rom-com heroine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like the I was looking at this chart recently just on its own as like a really fascinating chart and like a really literal one. Just given like all the memes recently. My partner showed me these memes about Drew Barrymore, and I guess they're going around like about Drew Barrymore interviews and like how the healing power of a Drew Barrymore interview, and just like that big Pisces stellium. I also know that she had a pretty difficult like childhood, and that's like a big part of her story. And she has this lovely moon in Cancer, which is like not surprising when just thinking about her as a person, but it's like technically enclosed by malefics.
Mm.
There's a conjunction with Saturn in Cancer, or it's separating from a conjunction with Saturn in Cancer and applying to an opposition with Mars.
Mhm.
which is like a pretty difficult situation, you would think.
Yeah.
But I was thinking that'd be interesting to look at things maybe from the perspective of a lot of fortune and see if we arrive at we're able to
Sure.
augment some of the things or what we get from that.
Well, something that's kind of standing out in her chart is, that rule of threes that sometimes people talk about in interpreting a chart. Like,
Yeah.
if just one thing is telling this story, like look for things that support it. And so
Mm-hmm.
right away, there's this interesting kind of fifth house repetition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or is that true actually? No, I'm looking at this wrong.
The fifth from fortune would be the
Yeah,
where
yeah.
the actual 10th house is.
So the thing that I think is interesting is if you look fifth from fortune, not only does she have this exalted Venus in Pisces, which is close to Jupiter, in the 10th, which is already like, yay.
Yeah. Oh
But
yeah.
then also, if you look at the fortune houses, this would be fifth from fortune, which adds like another like rejoicing condition onto what's going on with Venus here.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think that can be fun to look at like what is rejoicing from fortune as like again one of those like secret ways that maybe a
Mm.
planet is doing better than we otherwise would like judge it
Yeah.
to be at first. Um,
That's
eh,
so Venus would be like in its house joy and exaltation
yes,
from
uh,
fortune.
totally. And then even too with fortune being in Scorpio, ruled by that Mars in Capricorn, that brings like another exaltation.
Yeah.
Um, and so it kind of means that we can look at this Mars and we're going, ooh, it's enclosing the moon, like scary.
Yeah.
Um, but it adds like that nuance to what Mars is doing is like also Mars is trying to use its powers to like bring you fortune. That's like,
Yeah.
it adds on another role that Mars is playing in the chart, which is like the ruler of fortune. And
E-
so that's really handy to have in an exalted place.
exactly. That's it adds like a different way of looking at what Mars is doing for sure, like you said.
Mhm.
Because normally like Gemini rising, like Mars isn't always it's actually not too bad with Gemini rising. What is it? Virgo rising. Shoot, what am I thinking about? Yeah.
You're
Some
thinking about
charts have like the sort of jobs that a planet gets will make it a little more difficult or a little easier. So like for Cancer rising, like Mars is still Mars and can be a total pain in the ass, but it also rules like the fifth and 10th. So like it has a sort of like a job that is benefic, like in a certain context. Still, you're probably going to get both versions of Mars, but like it makes Mars more useful in a lot of ways and like can help sort of color like how bad maybe an aspect is or how bad a certain element with a planet is. Like, so like just looking at it from this angle as Mars ruling a life-giving place, uh, and it's exalted, it's ruling the life-giving lot of fortune. That opposition with Mars, while still a Moon Mars opposition, difficult, could maybe be seen as uh more productive potentially
Mhm.
than it might
Yeah,
be
it's like
otherwise.
because if we take out the words for the planets and just talk about delineations, right? It's like
Yeah.
the signifier of your general like life, body, emotions is
Hmm.
moving toward the signifier of life, fortune, success
Yeah,
from an exalted place. So we can, if we are,
exactly.
if you pick out those few, like this is what how it's going to show up in some parts of the life, and then the other stuff, which is going like, oh, it's moving towards the destructor. Like I'm sure that's also how it feels sometimes.
Yeah. And
Especially being
yeah.
like in the eighth. Um, you know, I'm
Yeah.
curious if she has like experience like death of somebody who is important to her, or yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. See, I said to you before this recording, I like grew up homeschooled, so I don't know anything about celebrities. I try my
I
best.
don't I don't really either. Like I don't know much about Drew Barrymore. In fact, I want to do more research on her now because it's a really interesting chart. It's like dignity off the charts. But all I know is that like she was a child actress and she had a pretty shitty early life. I don't know the specifics, but like like awful stuff.
Mhm.
But she's also become this like, you know, she was able to do a lot with those experiences, or do a lot of healing from
Mhm.
those experiences. And she, I guess she has like a talk show now, or something
Mhm.
like that. And doing the
Yeah.
Pisces thing of being like a force of healing and transmuting the difficulty and the pain.
Yeah, and even like looking at like the moon's last aspect and next aspect, like moving from this like detriment Saturn, right? Saturn in Cancer
Mm-hmm.
towards an exalted planet, Mars
Yeah.
in Capricorn. It's not necessarily like comfortable, but it is like you're
Yeah.
saying, it's like more useful and fortunate.
Yeah.
Even if there's like discomfort in like, and I mean, if you ever ask anyone who has like the smallest amount of fame, people tell you it's not easy. Like I'm sure it's not. I'm sure there's a
Uh,
lot of stuff that comes with like working in the film industry, having so many eyes on you.
mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, but since that is like she has this like stuff in the fifth from Fortune, and then Mars is third from Fortune. I don't know. There's like something in there that shows like at least she can really use it to express her creativity, to be communicating the things she wants to be saying,
Mm-hmm.
having fun with it. There's like something in her fortune which is about like, yeah, working in entertainment, getting to do things which are like fun, enjoyable, and
Leo would be the
it's like
10th from Fortune too.
mhm,
And like the sun trying a lot of Fortune.
mhm,
Like you were saying earlier, doubling up on signifiers. But I cut you
totally.
off. Continue, please.
Oh, no, no. Yeah. Yeah, just like it's interesting to see like where career signifiers come through. And of course the chart's always going to be telling all the things, right?
Yeah.
What is it that people are seeing? What is it you're personally experiencing? And yeah, that like enclosed moon, that's a toughie. It's no
Mm-hmm.
fun. But also with even bringing in Uranus conjunct Fortune, I know sometimes it's like, oh, do we do that?
Yeah.
Because Uranus is like a modern planet,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe there is
Yeah, I'm
like
open to
something
it.
unexpected that happened that really like changed um, her trajectory when it
Yeah.
comes to Fortune.
Yeah. That's like, yeah, like it's a, again, I don't know that much about her life. There's been a lot of like ups and downs, or but I imagine, uh, I don't know. I want to see now. I'm going to be doing some research on Drew Barrymore. Maybe I'll share it.
Three
Share
of
it another
Wands,
time.
Drew Barrymore movie marathon.
Oh,
Look
yes.
out.
It would be the next Netflix and chart recommendation. Um, but yeah, that was the only one I really had in mind. I've been looking at a lot of like charts with planets aspecting the lot of fortune lately to like sort of test it, and there does seem to be something with it. Uh, Granted, in her chart, other parts of the chart seem to be pretty literal as well, but if you just think of it as like an intensifier, sort of magnifier of a placement, is it's probably not gonna steer you too wrong.
Mhm.
I'm just thinking
Yeah.
of like the sorry, like last thought was if you're looking at it from the lot of fortune's perspective, the sun would be in the fifth house, a fifth from the lot of fortune, trying the lot of fortune, ruling the fortune 10th. So like somebody like it's already in the 10th, but like uh it's a strong placement for the ruler of the fortune 10th. And like it's solar. She's a celebrity. She's an actor. Like she's
Totally. Yeah.
yeah.
Total actor. Yeah.
It's there isn't all that much nuance to interpreting it. Like almost like it's
Mhm.
like very clear cut.
Right. And maybe this is something that we should have done before, but just like basic guidelines for interpreting a lot, right? Whether we're looking at the lot of fortune or lot of spirit or another kind of like more niche lot.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, first look at like where it falls, what house, right?
Hmm.
And so think of it as like, oh, that house is going to be more important for the matters that the lot is pertaining to.
Yeah.
Then you look at, is it aspecting any planets? Is like conjunct a planet? Does it have like a degree based aspect to another planet? That's going to really speak to it.
Hmm.
And then you look at what is the planet that's ruling the lot. Do they have a sign based aspect? Do they not see each other?
Hmm.
What is that planet doing? And and just like remember now that planet kind of holds that extra signification. And even in the really like niche little lots, like we were talking about Lord of Hidden Knowledge before, but there's other ones like that where if you're doing kind of a more complicated, like El Mutant type situation, and you're
Mhm.
looking at what planets are ruling all these different lots, it's like for the, for the process that you're doing, it's like, okay, well, so in this chart, using this specific divinatory like question we're doing, it's like, okay, Mars is representing, the boss, and Saturn's representing the child, and Jupiter's representing death, or it could be, it'll suddenly seem so random because it's like that's not what those that it's not what the nature of those planets usually is, but you can use them as like rulers of lots to go, oh, they actually are participating in this story in this way,
Yeah.
right? So it's like little decorations that
Hmm.
get plugged onto the planets, that they have these like additional significations. And because of the divinatory nature of lots, I don't know if they always hold those significations, or if it's like only when you ask. Do you know what I mean? Like there's kind of that
Hmm.
like pseudo quantum thing where it's like, oh, while the tarot card remains face down, like it could be anything, right? And it's
Yeah.
like only once you flip it that you really kind of lock it in. And I think there's something like that with lots, which is like, planets, they take on these additional significations once you do the calculations to find out the lots.
Hmm.
It's kind of like a fun, or like whatever question you're asking, it's kind of like this fun thing, which is like, yeah, it makes the chart go a bit infinite. I think I was saying to you before we were recording that, like, in the medieval astrology, they didn't have asteroids, they didn't have quincunxes and like all of the different modern aspects,
Hmm.
right? um they did have fixed stars, but like lots, that was like really where it went mega.
Yeah.
you know and and in a way they're kind of similar to modern aspects and asteroids, in this way where like they bring in this really specific, really kind of like additional layer to something, right? They add nuance. And but also they're kind of like an aspect in that you're measuring the distance between two planets and then projecting it, right? And so it's kind of like finding the hidden aspect between every planet.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I got my tie-in, I think, because I know we want to talk a little bit about other lots. Uh, maybe not a ton, but like maybe considering like which lots are a little more important, maybe, or which ones are useful. And I think that writing on what you were just saying is like it'll if you look at a chart that has just like 100 and something lots cast, which I've looked at before, and I'm like, what do I do with all this? Uh, if to simplify things, you can almost sort of like back out a little bit. And on the last episode, Tristan and I, that was we were talking about Almutants, right? And that the sort of idea that a planet has extra power because it controls different parts of the chart. The lots, like you were saying, like they're gives sort of planets a little extra job, but you can also maybe get an idea of like a planet that might have more power or be more important than maybe you realized at first or would assume just on like the basic chart because it like, oh, well, it rules
They have
like
all
this
these
lot
jobs.
and this lot and this lot and this lot. And like, holy crap, this planet's actually like way more important than you would just assume because, if it's Mars in a Mars and Virgo chart that rules like the um third and eighth house.
Mhm.
It's like, huh? Like Mars
There
doesn't seem
are
very important, but if it rules like the lot of fortune and like maybe the lot of spirit and like a bunch of like random lots in the 10th house, or something like, well, it wouldn't rule anyway.
I hear you.
Rules a bunch of stuff,
Mhm.
it's got more chips in its little bag than maybe holds a little more power and influence and sway.
It reminds me of the saying, there's no small parts, only small actors.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, if the planet is ruling a bunch of lots, then it's really making itself, more important just by sheer chutzpah.
Yeah, exactly. But maybe so we're getting start like moving towards wrapping up.
Sure.
We want to talk about, yeah, maybe talk about some other lots that maybe you found useful to use in your practice in general. Like, are there some that you maybe use more often than others?
Sure. I mean, maybe the Lot of Eros could be interesting to
Yeah.
talk about.
Yeah.
If do you want me to bring up Amber Rose?
Sure.
I had
Please
that example.
do it.
Um,
Another
one
12
moment,
Taurus
please.
placement. Why are you collecting so many of these? Feel like you're
This is not on
singling me
purpose.
out. No, no, yeah.
Here, I just have to stop sharing for a sec so that I can reach my tabs.
Hmm.
It's trying to block me. There we go. Here's Amber Rose. So this one is not like the tidiest example of this, but I was kind of looking at Amber Rose's chart um, to using lots as tiebreakers. Like I was thinking, a common thing that people will ask astrologers is like what their romantic relationships. And sometimes we can have this situation where you have um like competing testimony coming through a chart, like
Hmm.
maybe there's this like really strong planet in the seventh but the ruler is really not doing well, or vice versa, right? And so sometimes we ask like, oh, like which of those is like more true, you know? We might
Hmm.
be asking like which of them is talking about the general way that relationships will go versus a specific moment, you know? Is
Yeah.
it that they're going to be generally bad, but a specific moment is really nice, or they're going to be generally good, but there's a hardship?
Hmm.
The reason, I mean, Amber Rose's chart, she's got both is hard. There's this
Yeah.
fallen sun in Libra in the seventh, um, and then
Junk Pluto.
ruled by conjunct Pluto totally, and then uh, Libra is ruled by Venus in Virgo, which is also fallen conjunct
Yeah.
Mars. So it's like, ooh, that is
In the
telling a
sixth
story of
house. Yeah.
difficulty. Yeah,
Hmm.
totally the cadence of the ruler. So it's like, oh, we would look at this chart and think like this is probably someone who is having difficulty in relationships in her life. And I would say that's true. I had pulled this quote from a um, recent interview from her, and
Hmm.
it's we can swear, right? I think I already did, so
I've already
sorry.
sworn probably multiple times in this episode.
Didn't
Yeah,
notice.
you're good. Don't
But
worry.
so this is really recent 2023 Vanity Fair quote from Amber Rose. She's like, "It's worse than ever," Rose said of the current dating scene. "They're pretty disgusting out there. They're fucking gross. Like, I want to be single for the rest of my life."
It's like
She
Venus.
confessed.
Go ahead. Venus
Oh,
and Virgo
yep.
in particular, I feel like is like prone to getting grossed out.
Grossed out.
Hmm.
Yeah. She went on to emphasize, "I don't want to share my house or my life with anyone. I don't want anyone around my kids. I don't want to have sex. It's so gross. I don't want it." Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, like this is pretty strongly like, okay, we can see this in the chart.
Mars Venus
Um,
conjunction in Virgo.
totally. Um, Although, and then I always think this is funny with Amber Rose, and she's like, however, I could be a lesbian, but I don't know. Like, okay. But she says, like, what her main point is, I'm very happy to be not with anyone, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so this really shows up in her chart, but the thing that I thought was interesting is that she has a lot of Eros at 12 Taurus. And this is, I'm using the Paulus calculation for a lot of Eros here. And you can see that 12
Also
Taurus
ruled by
is
Venus. So.
also ruled by that same Venus, but it has that exact trine, right?
Yeah.
And it's in the second. And so the one thing that we at least can say of her relationships is like her relationship, especially like with Kanye West, I'm pretty sure it was like brought her into fame. Like she started getting into music videos. She started like having more career opportunities come her way. Which like kind of like happened through like who she was dating. And she dated a bunch of celebrity guys. And like that's obviously like that's not the total story of her life by any means, but
Hmm.
we can see this like small like, oh, there is at least that trine there that like she is able to like continue supporting herself, and that's like something that's connected to her relationships as well. But overall her like subjective experience of relationships is like really really difficult and hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Shoot, I got distracted by the Mercury Venus Antisha, which
Mm-hmm.
is interesting, probably for reasons that aren't related to the lot of fortune or any of the lots. But I don't actually know who Amber Rose is. Can you tell me?
Oh yeah.
Speaking of
um
celebrity ignorance.
um she is, yeah, she's a socialite. um I always think she has cool hair. She's like kind of popularized that like peach fuzz haircut where you have like a really
Mm.
short buzz but like a bright color.
Was she like an
That's what I
artist or
know her for.
musician or like a
She's a
writer?
performer.
performer.
She is performed in music videos as a hot lady. It's like most of
Okay.
her job is to be a hot lady. And like I don't say
Interesting.
that in a demeaning way, but like it's like she's well known for being fashionable, beautiful, um, and dating famous guys in a way that kind of like brought her more into fame as well.
It's fascinating because as somebody who doesn't actually like sex or relationships, and yet being a sort of a figure of like beauty,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a it's like an objectified sense of like Venus.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah.
I think she's definitely feels objectified in general.
Yeah, but to some degree, like, yeah, we're utilizing that. Like, we'll make use of that
Mm-hmm.
in some way with this
Yeah.
piece. But
And also Venus and Virgo too, I
mhm.
think there's a practical sense to it, which is like,
Oh
well,
yeah,
beauty has a purpose and I'll try to do
yeah.
try to do that thing.
When Mars is going to want to, it's like, let's just do something with it. Like, give it a purpose, a mission. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but do you happen to know which lot is calculated using Venus and Mars? The distance between the two? I
Uh
don't. Yeah, either.
I don't know, but we could always check AstroSeek. They have a really good resource, which is like a table of like most lots that have ever been written about. So you want me to scroll through and see if we can find any cool Venus Mars lots that would be conjunct or ascendant?
Uh, yeah, do it. I'm looking at Astroseek right now. I might find it first.
Okay, well, I'm sharing my screen, so I'll just bring it up.
Oh yeah, yeah, you do it. Yeah, you'll probably be better at it anyway. But I was just thinking that like that conjunction, also the fact that it's a conjunction is going to bring that lot to the ascendant. So it's like adds extra juice to like whatever the planets are doing, whatever those two
Mhm.
planets are doing, which is interesting.
This is the lot calculator.
It makes it
Um,
secretly super, even maybe not that secretly, but just super powerful or
totally.
influential.
So what we can do in this place on AstroSeek that's pretty interesting is we can plug in Venus and Mars into the top
Ah,
and search for them. Um, and so here it says the lot of activity, the lot of play and plays, the lot of rapid change and variety.
interesting.
Those are ones that are taken from Venus and Mars, which would be close to Ambrose's ascendant. And then this is something we haven't touched on yet, but a lot of the medieval lots, instead of being reversed by sect, they actually have you reversed by gender. So
Mm,
you can see some of these say reverse for women.
yeah.
That's again something I think you can experiment with. Obviously, it's not going to work for non-binary people.
Hmm.
I've seen some people just if it says reverse by gender, they just reverse by sect instead. Some people do think that reversing by gender is useful, so kind of like play around with how you want to do it in your practice. I'm just gonna see if there's any Mars to Venus ones that we missed.
That does make it
Yeah.
a little bit interesting. Even if you were to do that, if it's say a conjunction between Mars and Venus, you're going to get the same result
Mm-hmm.
regardless,
Totally.
which kind of blends with like some of the symbolism of Mars Venus combinations. Is like a if you were to root your interpretation in the gendered component of both planets, uh, you would still end up with like a blending, I guess, of significations.
Totally, because it'll show up similarly for everyone. So if
Yeah.
I switch these to go Mars to Venus and three other lots showed up, the lot of disappointment, the lot of endings, and the lot of passion, emotion, and affection.
What a fun lot. A lot of disappointment.
No, I know
Yeah.
a lot of disappointment.
Yeah.
Ambrose has had a lot of disappointment.
Uh, just thinking about where mine probably is now. Um, uh, yeah, which
But I think that kind of speaks to that like
puts it in the
Venus
first.
Mars. Like if you just think about those two planets, it's like what does Venus want? Wants pleasure, joy, love, right?
Yeah.
Beauty. What does Mars want? It kind of wants to cut to the chase, end things that aren't working. It wants to, yeah, be like proactive. It wants to sometimes like express violence or express energy or express
Yeah.
erotic passion. So there's like some similarities and some opposition between Venus and Mars. So
Yeah.
what happens when you blend them together? It's like
Pleasure and pain.
both. Yeah,
Yeah.
pleasure and pain together. Or
Hmm.
like, oh, I really want this relationship. Actually, no, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. But that maybe goes to show you too that like there's different idea, like there's different lot, like different astrologers have used the same planets to calculate different lots or to find different things, or even to calculate more than one.
Mhm.
So there's like a lot of nuance and a lot of, ways you could potentially experiment to some degree.
Totally. And
Um,
it's very cultural, right? Because like
yeah.
there's people will kind of make fun of lots to be like, what does Venus and Mercury have to do with lentils, or or something
Mhm.
like that. And it's because, well, if you live in a part of the world where like there's a ton of lentil farmers, then like especially in mundane astrology, that's the other place that lots were used a lot in medieval predictions is like on the Aries ingress chart. You'd run lots on it to
Yeah.
see how stuff's going to be going on with the nation or with the people. Um, and so if you specifically are looking at the Aries ingress chart, which again is like the planets are in the same places for everywhere,
Hmm.
but the thing that changes is the ascendant degree based on like where on earth you're putting the Aries ingress chart to. That's like where then lots becomes really interesting because you can get a lot more nuance out of the mundane chart than you might otherwise. Like sometimes I've thought about that with the US and Canada, right? You live
Hmm.
in the States, I live in Canada, but both of our capitals are pretty close to each other by what is it, latitude,
Oh yeah.
longitude.
Hmm.
And so the Aries ingress charts often look like almost identical for Canada and the States. They're like 2 degrees off. And so I've wondered, like, okay, like, I wonder how we can be looking at these charts for nuance to talk a bit about what's going on in Canada versus the States, even though a lot of our mundane charts look the same. And I think one way, obviously, compare it to the birth chart of the country. Um, and then also, I think lots is an interesting way that could like show some differences.
Yeah.
I looked up to make find Amber Rose's career titles.
Uh-huh.
Um, and she is a model is probably the best word because she was signed as a model, had a bunch of contracts.
Hmm.
She's also a rapper somewhat. She like has released rap
Okay.
singles. Um, but
I'm
yeah,
sure they're
but
good.
the career title for appearing in music videos, at least according to Wikipedia, is video vixen. And this
Ah.
was also in her like there's kind of like a biographical uh documentary made about her or whatever, which
Mhm.
is called like Video Vixen to A-list Badass. And so that definitely is like her origin story, right? It's like appearing in music videos as a vixen.
That's that's fitting. Uh, I was just thinking though as well the what you will get right when you're calculating a chart that is maybe the same place in whatever the is it
Longitude.
longitude, yeah, same longitude but different latitude is you'll get like differences in the midheaven, right?
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if there are any lots that are also use the midheaven calculation instead of the ascendant,
There are
perhaps.
some, yeah. And I think actually in mundane astrology, that's more common because you might
Yeah.
be looking at more midheaven related topics.
Hmm.
And then there's even some lots that project from a third planet. Like I know one of the lots in
Yeah.
the Lord of
I've
Hidden
seen this one.
Knowledge projects from Mercury instead of the ascendant. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's really get creative with it. I feel like when we get into the tinier lots, it's something that like astrologers could get like fun and creative and create little systems with them, like in a
Yeah.
similar way that tarot readers will like post custom spreads on their Instagrams being like, oh, here's a spread on how to ask this question.
Yeah.
Like it feels like a place where there's like a lot of creativity and like innovation is possible of astrologers going, oh, like do you want to answer this specific question? Like
Hmm.
look at these lots and figure it out, and we can kind of create our own like set of what 5 to 8 lots, like calculate these and then find the almutin of them, and then it'll tell you something about this. Like I think there's like a
Hmm.
lot of flexibility there. Like I think this is where astrology gets really divinatory, and it really comes down to that conversation that you're having in person. Because I've done some like lot type work with clients, like including the smaller lots that have to do with their really specific question. And it's always like it's always the conversation that we have along the way, right? Where we're really like figuring out what does every single lot bring to the conversation, what nuance is it bringing. That's like where kind of the juice is. And like in the end, when you go, okay, so your Lord of Hidden Knowledge is Venus, they're like,
Hmm.
cool, because now they know what that means. Now they know, oh, this conversation that we had about what this planet is doing, that's the one I should try to take the most guidance from because it's where the most strength is. Like there's a lot of El Mutiny type stuff that you end up doing in the end,
Yeah,
with those more complex ones. But even if you just want to look at one lot, it's like think of one lot that can add more nuance to a house, right? Like if you're looking at the third house, which is like, are we talking about my neighbors? Are we talking about my brothers and sisters? Are we talking about my shrine? Are we talking about my bicycle? Like, all
hmm
these like third housey type things that the house can mean. You can kind of like look at lots to add nuance to each of those topics. Um,
for sure.
if you are really wanting to like zone in on something in your chart.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe it's the simple answer to like the second half of Chris's question. It's just like which lots are worth focusing on, other than like the lot of fortune. Like in theory, all of them. Like there's a lot of like exploration and research to do still. And like you can like cast the lots, see how they show up, like explore. Um but there's also probably I'm like thinking of it in terms of like the fixed stars. Like you get your four royal stars that are like probably your lot of fortune and your lot of spirit would be like the two top tier um lots. Spirit having to do a little more with like vocation actions taken in life, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Um but then you also have your hermetic lots. There's seven, right? Well, a lot of fortune and a lot of spirit are two of them.
Mm-hmm.
But have you done a lot of work with the hermetic lots?
Not a ton. Um, I don't have my own memorized where they all are.
I know.
Um,
I don't either.
but
A
I
lot of
think
Eros is one of them as well.
yeah, Eros, necessity,
Hmm.
uh, yeah, I don't even remember the names of all of them. So clearly that
I
answers
know.
some of the question. But what I think is interesting to do with them is like it's like, do you have a specific inquiry, right? Because if you're just like you're saying, making a chart with that's got 100 lots in it, that's going to be really muddy and like difficult to delineate because we're asking too many questions at the same time,
Hmm.
right? Like there's something about clarity that like lots provide nuance and clarity to a question.
Hmm.
Like I think that's like really what they do. Other than fortune and spirit, which then you get really timing is the other thing that they give. Like we haven't talked about zodiacal releasing at all, but the lot of spirit especially becomes important in zodiacal releasing because you're moving the lot of spirit around the chart to get more information from that lot, right? Um,
Yeah.
and so some people will release other lots other than Fortune and Spirit, like Chris Brennan when he was like a teenager was like, we should release the lot of Eros so that I can learn more about romance. Although Valen says the lot of Fortune tells you about romantic relationships, so I still like remain kind of skeptical about the Eros releasing. But
Yeah.
whatever, whatever. But like
Yeah.
when it comes to other lots, like you're not going to get a lot from releasing the lot of lentils if especially if you're not a lentil farmer, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like this is why like you need to know what question you're asking. Um,
Exactly. And I think, I mean, to some degree, uh, the lots add potential for clarity. They can also um add like a
contradiction.
ambiguity to,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, contradiction to like what you're seeing in the chart. And it'll sometimes give you a sense of like why maybe some area of life is more of a mixed bag than you would think it would be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, this person has a nasty Mars Saturn conjunction in Cancer in their seventh house, but like maybe they had some issues in relationships early on in life, maybe, and then it got a little better, or it just like seems to be going better than you would expect from the chart. Like, take a look at the lots, maybe look at the lot of Eros,
Totally.
or houses from Fortune.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm sure there are a lot of other lots that like speak to relationships in some way.
Totally.
You could like see how those stack up.
Yeah. Well, there's like, yeah, there's there's so many lots that have to do with
Just
relationship.
lots of
Like there's
lots.
some lots that are about like what kinks are you gonna have. There's some that are like how long are you gonna be married for? How many partners are you gonna have? Like
Yeah.
like it can get there's so many because that's like one of the most common questions that astrologers are asked. So of course astrologers wanted to find lots of ways to get more nuance on the questions, right?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think the thing that I like to do with the lots, yeah, you use them as tiebreakers, use them to add nuance. Still, we're looking at like the chart as being like that's the root, right? That's the story. We're rooting it all in. The lots
Hmm.
add a layer. Um, and it can be useful for timing too. Like even if you don't want to learn
Hmm.
zodiacal releasing, which I do think is a really fun way to use lots.
Hmm.
And I don't think it's as complicated as people say. Yeah, I find it fairly straightforward. But
Hmm.
even like a really easy timing to technique to do with lots is perfections. You
Oh yeah.
can also do perfections not just from your ascendant,
Hmm.
but from anything. And the Lot of Fortune is a really common one to do perfections annually from as well, and say, oh, like um, anytime you're in a 10th house year from the ascendant, you'll also be in a 10th from fortune year, right? Like
Yeah.
all the 10th houses from everything starts to light up. And so I think that can be a kind of like an introductory way to use lots for timing
Oh yeah.
is to say, like, yeah, like for me, if I was in a 10th house year, I'm not right now, I'm in an 8th house year. But if I was, that would be highlighting Aries, my 10th house, but also Gemini, my 12th house, because it's 10th from fortune. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And that can kind of be interesting in the it might hint at like what areas of your life tend to like pop up together. Because like
mhm,
your ascendant and your a lot of fortune are always going to have that like same relationship with each other. So when you're perfecting, like, well, those the if it's in your third house, right, it's always going to be houses sextile to each other that pop up. So like when your third comes up, your fifth tends to come up too. And uh
totally.
it can tell you like maybe give you some hints about like certain patterns. Um
Mhm.
I've also noticed too, just in terms of like a subtle like a timing component, is that transits to the lot of fortune do seem to like be pretty relevant and significant. I'll see like things show up like in a kind of more visible way. Like I I like it when benefics hit my lot of fortune. I usually see something nice happen. Mars hitting my lot of fortune does seem to show up in actual disputes or conflicts like
Mhm.
in my life. So I'm like,
Yeah, I'm pretty
it makes it a
sure
little louder, you know?
a transit that I had when I came out as trans
Hmm.
was there was the transiting Mercury Cazimi over my lot of spirit.
Oh wow,
So
interesting.
there you go. That's the only kind of like lot transit that comes to mind. But
Yeah.
it really speaks to the event, which is like Mercury and Sun coming together, like a realization that I need to communicate something about my identity, blah, blah. That's very Mercury Cassini stuff. And
Oh
then
yeah.
going over my lot of spirit, which is about like putting that will out there into the world. You know, there's a lot of like a lot of spirit is really about agency because
Hmm.
it's a lot of the sun. It's kind of like a second sun in some ways, but it really holds that kind of like vocation, intellect, willpower, like all those kind of like asserting stuff out there into the world. And so I thought like coming out as there was a Mercury Cazimi over my lot of spirit made a lot of sense.
Total. Actually, I'm glad you said that because I it's like one of the patterns that have showed up for me is that transits to my lot of spirit have definitely shown up as developments in my not even like the for me not as much stuff in the world but stuff in like within myself of like what I want to do changing or evolving in some way. Like Saturn with my was on my lot of spirit when I was like you could say I officially got sucked down the rabbit hole of astrology and like it ended up becoming a thing that I wanted to do professionally. And um, yeah, I think in terms of lots that are to as a starting point of paying attention to would be the lot of fortune and a lot of spirit, and just you can do some simple things like note transits to them and see what happens. Um,
Totally. Tracking
yeah,
transits, so fun.
yeah,
That's like astrology. That's what brings astrology alive, I think, right?
hmm
Because like especially if you're having conversations with people about their life, like I always feel a little bit like weary of telling people delineations that I haven't like necessarily seen in my own
Hmm.
experience. And
Yeah.
not that I think they're wrong necessarily, but I always kind of caveat them of being like, I've heard it can mean this, um
That's the Earth
but
Jupiter.
there's this kind of like confidence that I get in being able to go like, ah yeah, like I do have like a little bit of practical experience with like noticing what's happened there. Um and also when you start paying attention, you can see the transits happening, right? Like
Totally.
sometimes whenever I don't think that transits are happening for me, something happens that proves me wrong, or
Hmm.
I've just like didn't take the time to reflect. And then I'm like journaling and I'm like, oh, there you
Yeah.
go. There was a transit.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes it's like more mild stuff too that just isn't stupendously obvious.
Again, with our negativity bias. What
Yeah.
if it was a good thing? We
Yeah.
just didn't notice because it was a good thing.
Mhm.
Like, oh,
But
I tried to do this talk and it went moderately well.
yeah.
Check. That could be a transit.
um, but I think that we could go on forever. I think that this might be a good stopping point. Just we've at least opened the door to some of the other lots. It's such a big door though. We could do episodes worth just on a couple of these fun lots. But I feel like I want to start playing with the lots a little more at this point because just seeing like in practice how you can start to see themes, and to some degree like you should just start simple too when you're like exploring them. It's like, well, what does the fortune 10th do, like the 10th house from the lot of fortune? Have you noticed any themes around career with that for in your chart or in people you know's chart, and start there, and then maybe you can dig into some of the other lots. Or do what I like to do is just dive face first into all of it. It's really
Mhm.
however you prefer.
Yeah, and I think like if people are interested in booking, having a lots conversation, it's
Mhm.
funny because I often like if I'm doing lots for someone, I'll do like a lot of writing down. It's like very, yeah, it gets into that
Oh, how do you calculate the lot of
mercurial.
writing down? Yeah.
Gets
Anyway.
into that very like mercurial place for me where I make sure that I have everything on paper. I write down different delineations, like so there's a really like solid foundation to work off of. You might have noticed in this conversation, I don't have all the lot calculations memorized, and I don't necessarily
Yeah.
think that that's necessary because again, they're like this divinatory thing. I like to think that they only matter after you calculate them
Hmm.
in some ways. And so I always just kind of like sit down, create a spreadsheet. We get to talk it through. Um, it's and yeah, and if you want to get to know any specific planet in your chart, I think adding the fortune house and any lots that it's ruling that
Hmm.
are immediately apparent is a really good way to get to know like, oh, what are the nuances to how Venus is working or to how Mercury is working, etc.
Yeah, sure. What's so you said you will do readings kind of like based on the lots. Where
Yep,
can people book a reading with you?
sure. My website is innernature.ca because I'm Canadian.
Yeah.
You can also check out my link tree for all my socials, but I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm findable and I'm very DM friendly. Just send me a message or an email or something. You can find it. Um, my link tree is Milo AO, but also I'm sure there'll be a link somewhere that you can find it. Um, yeah, and I think lots are a really fun way to have a like really detailed, specific conversation about a topic in your life.
Mhm.
And so, like, if you want to map out the intricacies of how your romantic relationships work, or if you want to really come to understand your relationship with like your individual siblings, or
Mhm.
um, you want to understand like your career timing, like those are all things that I think lots can be really fun for. Oh,
Yeah.
and of course, psychic powers. A lot of
Yes.
lot of
Yeah.
hidden knowledge. Let's do that one.
Um, awesome. Yeah. Anything else that you have going on that you want to bring people uh in on, let people know about?
Sure. I'm a co-organizer of a local astrology group called YEG Astrology. which is based in Edmonton, Alberta area, but we have free monthly like sign by sign meetups, which are held over meetup.com. So so far this year we've done the Aries meetup, we just did our
Mhm.
Taurus meetup. So we do one like free kind of just like virtual presentation and group discussion for each sign. And also if you live in my local area, I'm going to be starting an in-person workshop series. I have one in the beginning of May, which is like a sun moon rising uh, astrology workshop. So bring your chart, bring your birth data. We can take a look at how to start delineating, yeah, like the places of life, the sun, the moon, the rising sign, and the ascendant ruler. Yeah, and then I always post stuff up on my socials and Linktree if I have different podcast spots or whatever. I got a few coming out, so yeah, that's how you can find me.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely check the show notes or the description for some links to Milo's stuff. And yeah, as for me, as usual, you can book a read with me through my website, kylepierceastrologer.com. And I think we'll call it a wrap. I'm getting sleepy. We've been talking about quite a lot. And
That was a lot.
it was a lot. It's a lot to process, all these lots.
Thanks, everyone. So happy to
Yes.
be here.
and thank you so much for joining, Milo. This is I feel like we really, no pun is coming to my mind, so I'm just going to say that I feel like we really got a lot covered, and like a compelling introduction to the lots. Like I feel significantly more interested in the lots than I was before, and I think listeners will feel the same way. And I think that is thanks to the expertise and insights that you have brought today. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to have you back on one of these days.
Thanks, Kyle. And I hope we got at least 2 lots covered.
Yes, I think we did. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'm sure there's more to promote, but I think we'll wrap it up. Well, yeah. Oh, nah, not today.
You got nothing.
Yeah, I'm spent. So thanks so much for listening to all of you, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
For now. If you have a question you would like to hear answered on Astrology Hotline, shoot us an email at astrologyhotlinepod@gmail.com.